morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Perez, and I'm a senior associate here at Scott Legal PC. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about options for e-visas with lower investment amounts in businesses often considered high risk, such as real estate, equity trading firms, and consulting businesses. Just a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that our firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, a TN, B, and an H-1B. Scott Legal PC is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in several different areas, including the E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risks, such as those with lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we will send out several useful tools. We will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, a link where you can download additional guides that go through the visa options in more detail, and also a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. So this webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. We will also send you a link for that. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. We'll also send you a link where you can arrange a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys if you would like to discuss your case in more detail. If you have any questions throughout this presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So today I will be presenting the first half of the webinar, but we also have our partner, Kelly Weiner, who will present the last half. We're lucky to have Kelly join us. Kelly is a Harvard business trained partner and an expert in corporate and employment-based immigration. She has extensive experience working with the E-2 visas, especially those that are considered high risk. So without further delay, we will get started with this webinar. Okay, so we'll first start with discussing the E-2 visa requirements. In order to be eligible for the E-2 visa, you must be a national of a treaty country. This means you need to hold a passport from an E-2 treaty country. The Department of State has a list available on their website of the E-2 treaty countries, and occasionally that list is updated with additions and changes, but currently there are over 80 listed countries. As I stated, you need to hold a passport from a treaty country. However, you don't need to have been born in an E-2 treaty country. So as an example, if you are born in India, but you have parents who are born in Australia or a different country and have citizenship in Australia, then you could potentially be eligible for that E-2 visa because you hold a passport from Australia through your parents. So the fact that you hold a passport from Australia means that you satisfy this national requirement. So another requirement would be that you need to own 50% of the E-2 visa company. The business can take almost any form, such as an LLC or a corporation, but you need to own at least 50% of that company. You can own exactly 50%, you can own 100%, but if you own 49%, 49.5%, that would not be sufficient. The moment your ownership drops below the 50%, you would actually be ineligible for the E-2. So later on, if you do have an E-2 company and you decide to sell part of your ownership in that company, if you drop below that 50% mark, you would become ineligible for that E-2. So you need to keep in mind in the future, if you're going to sell the company, how much are you going to sell? So you need to continuously meet the eligibility requirements of the E-2 visa the entire time you hold that visa. So this also means that you could potentially have 2 E-2 investors supported by one E-2 company. So for an example, if you have the Italian passport and you have a friend who holds an Australian passport and you both want to open a business under the E-2 company, if you each own 50% of the company, you could each apply for that E-2 investor visa. You would each also have to still satisfy all the requirements of the E-2 visa, but it is certainly possible to have 2 E-2 investors who own 50% of the company and each having an E-2 investor visa. Another requirement is that you must make a substantial investment in the business. So a common question we would get is, how much do I need to invest in the business and what is substantial? Unfortunately, there's not an exact dollar amount for you to rely on for the E-2 visa, but in general, when trying to determine what a substantial investment is, you should first consider what amount is sufficient to make this business fully operational. So consider, have you purchased everything the business needs to make it fully operational? For example, do you have the equipment, the licenses, the lease, the inventory, everything needed for this business to start running? So each business will be different. For instance, if you have a consulting company, it would require less investment to make it fully operational than, say, the manufacturing plant. So after considering the amount to make this business fully operational, there is another consideration. You would still want to consider, do I have a minimal amount in the eyes of the government to be substantial? For instance, you could have this consulting company and you can make it fully operational with just $5,000. However, this is generally not going to be enough in the eyes of the government to be substantial. So as I mentioned, the first step is kind of looking at, have I invested enough to make this business fully operational? The second step would kind of be, have I invested a minimal amount in the eyes of the government to be substantial? So generally, we recommend to our clients that they invest at least $50,000. But again, it really depends on the type of business that you're planning on opening. It can also depend where you're going to apply. So which consulate you will be applying at could affect how much money you invest in your business. Another consideration or requirement is the funds you invest must be at risk. This means it's not enough to simply set up a business bank account where you place your E-2 funds. The funds need to be spent. So if you transfer $100,000 from your personal bank account into this E-2 business bank account, you would then need to spend those funds on things related to the business that make it operational. For example, have you obtained the commercial lease? Have you obtained the inventory, the equipment, paid for marketing fees, legal fees to set up this E-2 business? You want to show the officer that you have bought everything you need to make this business fully operational. You can have a certain amount of the funds reserved as working capital. So it's okay that out of the $100,000 that you've transferred to this E-2 business account, you've maybe only spent 70 to 80% of the funds, and therefore you would have $20,000 to $25,000 sitting in the bank account reserved as the working capital. We would still say your total investment is the $100,000, even if you have some of the funds not spent reserved for the working capital. It is just important to remember that you've spent most of the funds you're claiming to invest. So you will not get the E-2 visa if you simply transfer the $100,000 but don't spend those funds. You really need to commit most of those funds to the E-2 company. So we also have the source of funds. The government needs to be satisfied that the source of your funds is lawful and legitimate. The scope of what is acceptable can be quite broad. So the funds could come from a gift from a family member, a friend. You can get a loan as long as the loan is secured by your personal assets, not secured by the E-2 company. You could use inheritance. You could also use income you've earned over the course of several years. The government is accepting of many types of sources as long as you can show where the funds have come from and that they were obtained lawfully and legitimately. So we would like to emphasize that the government can have a high documentation requirement to show that you obtain these funds lawfully. So you do need to make sure you have documentation showing exactly where you've obtained these funds from. This is especially the case if you're inside the US and you are applying for the E-2 visa through USCIS. So USCIS can be very strict about where the source of funds have come from and the documentation you provide. So conversely, consulates often have a page limit, so they don't spend as much time looking at the source of funds. However, even if you were to apply through the consulate, you should still be able to explain and be prepared to show that you obtain the funds lawfully. So you should be able to show through the documentation where these funds came from. We'll next discuss, so how much is enough? We'll talk a little bit about this later in the presentation, but just to keep in mind, you really want to think about the type of business you're starting. What are the reasonable costs for this business? And what would be needed to make this business fully operational? So typical E2 expenditures generally include inventory, equipment, website setup, office supplies, rent for the office or warehouse, marketing fees, business entity setup. So you're just kind of thinking about, when thinking about the expenditures to include, you should again consider the type of business and what would this business need to be operational. You'd want to show the government you've purchased everything you need in order to begin running this business as soon as you get this E-2 visa. So if you're starting a restaurant and you need a health license, you would want to show that you've contacted the health department, paid for this license, and you've applied for it or you've already obtained it. Okay. So other requirements for the E-2 visa. There's also a requirement called the marginality requirement. This means that the business, the E-2 business, would be able to support more than just the investor and their family. So really, you must show the government that you will hire U.S. workers in the U.S. to work at this E-2 business, or that you've purchased the business and you will continue to employ U.S. workers. So we typically recommend that the business employ at least 3 full-time workers, U.S. workers, within 5 years of starting the operations. This is a broad statement and wouldn't necessarily apply to each business. You really should, again, consider the type of business that you're intending to open and operate. But in general, employing at least 3 full-time U.S. workers would help mitigate any other weaknesses with the case. So for example, if you have this low investment amount, but you've already hired a couple U.S. workers, this would really shift the focus to the strengths of the case versus the weaknesses of the case. So the earlier you can start hiring, the better. If you can hire a U.S. worker even before you submit the petition, that would also significantly strengthen your case. And again, so since we're talking about risky or lower investment amounts here in this webinar, the consideration, you could consider taking some of your investment funds to hire a U.S. worker. And again, this would really show the officer that in spite of the low investment amount, you've already started this company, it's already operating, you already have a U.S. worker, you're already hiring people here in the U.S. Okay. So another consideration, so if you cannot show the government that you will hire these U.S. workers, even if you have invested a significant amount of money, you will still be denied. So you really do need to show that you will hire the U.S. workers. So the next requirement will be that you will need to show that the business is real and operating. So the business doesn't need to be operating before you submit the application. What the requirement means is that once you arrive with this E-2 visa, you're ready to begin the operation. So again, you need to be able to show the officer that you've bought everything the business needs to be operational. You need to have proof that you've taken all the necessary steps. So once you enter the US, you're ready to go. Again, you can include things like a commercial lease. You already have a location where you'll be operating out of. If you have hired any employees, you can show the payroll. You can show that you've purchased the necessary equipment and you have the inventory. Examples such as those can help really show that your business is real and operating. Okay. So you must also be coming to the US to develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. This means you as the E-2 investor will be coming here to just develop and direct the business. You're not going to come here to work for another company. You're not going to come here to work a side gig. So you really need to, the intent of your coming to the US will be to direct and develop the E-2 company specifically. So you do need to be qualified to develop and direct the business, but just because you haven't worked in the industry or for a business, the same type of business, it doesn't mean you wouldn't be able to qualify. This is generally a very low bar, but it does require an explanation. So if you can provide an explanation, connect the dots for the officer to show that you're qualified to direct and develop this business, then you should be able to satisfy this requirement. So you do, again, need to own at least 50% of the company. The screen says ownership of greater than 50%. However, it is 50% or more. But 50% is sufficient. You just need to show that you have control of the business. You need to be able to make the business decisions. So, on another note, this really applies to USCIS applications. You need to be careful if you intend to be the sole worker at the business for a period of time. The government doesn't want to see that you're coming to the US to really be the one providing the goods and services to your customers. So, this would mean if you're coming to the US to provide those goods and services, you're competing with other people in the US labor market. This would be a negative for your application. So a way to mitigate this, if you're coming to the US or you're already in the US, for example, if you're a student and you want to obtain the E-2 visa, you've just graduated with an accounting degree, you want to open an accounting firm, a risky application would be showing that you're not planning on hiring an accountant for 2 or 3 years. USCIS would assume that you're coming to the US to perform the accounting services. So to strengthen your application, you could show that you want to hire another employee who will be serving as an accountant. Even if this person was part-time, you can at least show the officer or the government that you will not be the one necessarily performing these services for the customers. Your intent is really to come direct and develop the E-2 business. You need to also show that you have the intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of your E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is not a green card and it does not lead to permanent residency. It's a temporary non-immigrant visa, which means you're allowed to enter the US for a temporary period of time to accomplish the specific purpose, which is to direct and develop this E-2 business. So this doesn't mean that you can't come to the US intending to stay for a longer period of time. You can come to the US intending to enter with the E-2 and renew this E-2 visa. And in fact, you can renew the E-2 visa indefinitely. The requirement is just saying that the E-2 visa cannot be used to immediately come to the US and immediately apply for a green card. It's fine if your plans change later on, but the intent is really what matters. And the intent would be that you're coming to the US with the E-2 to operate the E-2 business. So with the E-2 visa, you can also start a new business. You can purchase an existing business, or you can even start a franchise. All 3 of these options are fairly common and work well under the E-2 visa. If you're buying a business, a couple things to keep in mind would be to look at this business, and if it's been operational for a few years already, what does that business look like? Do they already have US workers or is it a solo operation? If it's a solo operation, then you're kind of creating a hurdle for yourself because you do need to show the officer, again, that this is not a marginal business, that you will hire other US workers. So if the company does not currently have any US workers and you purchase that business, it will show the officer that you may not intend to hire US workers. If you're buying a business and you're concerned with putting a significant amount of money on the line to buy this business, you do have the option of escrow. Escrow is the one exception to the requirement that your investment needs to be at risk. So previously we said it's not enough to just take your funds and stick it in the E-2 bank account. That would not be sufficient for the government. But the one exception is that you could put your funds in escrow under the condition that those funds will be released from escrow to the seller of the business immediately upon the issuance of your visa. So the issuance of the visa is the one condition. If all the other conditions met, this would be accepted by the government. So the one condition is once I get this visa, the funds will be released, and this is generally fine to put people's minds at ease if they're worried about investing a significant amount of money, but not sure that they will get their visa. Okay, so we'll also discuss a little bit about how long is my E-2 visa valid. The validity dates of the E-2 visa can vary from 3 months to 5 years, and the amount of time really depends on the agreement that the U.S. has with the E-2 treaty country, the country which you have the passport from. So you should keep in mind, even if you're eligible for a visa that could be for 5 years, the adjudicating officer would have the discretion to limit the length of the visa. Reasons they may limit the length of the visa could just include the strength of the case. So an officer may request you to return to the consulate if they feel like your case is weak and they want you to come back to renew the visa to really see if you're meeting the eligibility requirements of the E-2. So once you are given the visa, the valid visa means that you can now seek entry into the US. When an E-2 investor enters the US, CBP will issue them what's called the I-94. This will give you the E-2 status. The I-94 typically is granted for 2 years of authorized stay, and each time you enter the US in valid E-2 status, CBP will generally issue you an I-94 showing that you have 2 years of authorized stay. So the I-94 issued by CBP is independent of the visa stamp, the visa expiration stamp. So while you're in the US under E-2 status, the I-94 serves as proof that you're authorized to be in the US and work for the E-2 company. So as long as the I-94 admit until date has not expired, you're legally allowed to continue working for the qualifying E-2 business. And each time you leave and re-enter the US with the valid E-2 visa, CBP will typically refresh your I-94 and give you an additional, give you 2 years, which would allow you to work in the US. So regardless of whether your visa is valid for 3 months or 5 years, you typically get the 2 years of E-2 status from CBP. The moment you leave the US is when that E-2 visa validity period becomes relevant. So if you are issued the 3-month visa, but then you enter the US and you're given 2 years of E-2 status, you could stay in the US for 2 years. However, if you intend to travel and that 3-month visa has expired, you would then need to return to the consulate and renew your visa. So with the 3-month visa, you do often see that people stay in the US and extend their E-2 visa through USCIS. This would avoid having you go back to the consulate. Okay, so we also discussed how much investment is enough. So we touched upon this at the beginning of the presentation, but again, the law does not define a dollar amount for the E-2 visa, unlike the EB-5. The law says you need to invest a substantial amount. So the negative is that there is some uncertainty with how much is enough. But the positive is that you can get approved with a fairly low amount. Again, it would just depend on the type of business. The important thing to show is that you've invested the minimal amount in the eyes of the government officer and that your business is fully operational. So typically you do want to hit at least $50,000. That's what we would recommend at a minimum. But it would depend on the type of business. So if you have the manufacturing plant, again, it would be significantly higher than the $50,000. Once you hit the $50,000 mark, and you've invested enough for the business to be operational, we typically don't see that the investment amount is really a big issue. So it does just depend on the type of business, what's needed to make that business fully operational, and which consulate you're going to apply at. We already touched upon that the money must be spent. The money can't just be sitting in the business bank account. You need to show that you've spent these funds on the E-2 business. Again, it's really dependent on the type of business that you're planning on operating. So the government does have a proportionality test. We won't spend too much time discussing this, but in general, the test compares the amount you've invested to the total cost of the business you're buying or creating. The question is whether your investment represents a meaningful percentage of what is required for the business to function successfully. The test works on a sliding scale. So the lower cost of the business would require a higher percentage of the investment. So if your business cost $100,000 to be to be operational, you may be required to invest close to 100% of that total cost. Conversely, if the business cost um, thousands or millions of dollars to start, then a smaller percentage would be considered substantial for the investment. So you may end up investing only 10% if you're going to open a manufacturing plant that costs millions of dollars to operate. So we'll also discuss a little bit about strategies to deal with the lower investment amounts. So the first step would really be to look at your application as a whole. After looking at your application as a whole, you want to identify the positive factors of your case. So again, have you already hired the US workers? Do you have contracts? Have you previously run a similar business abroad? The investment amount is really just one of several requirements. And if you have the low investment amount, you can really just want to focus on the strengths of your case. So if you have this lower investment amount, but you've already hired 3 US workers, this will really strengthen your case. If you have multiple workers, this would be best. Full-time employees would be better over part-time, but part-time would be better over the independent contractors. But all of these options are better than not having any employees at all. So you're really trying to show the officer that you're serious about running this business. You are going to create work opportunities for US workers, and the officer hopefully won't focus as much on the lower investment amount. So other ways you can show your company is likely to be successful and likely to employ US workers is to show interest in your products or your services. You can do this by obtaining contracts if you're already operational. You can try to obtain letters of intent from potential clients. If you're outside the US, you can hire a US worker that can operate the business. Because again, hiring a US worker is a really positive factor. Other ways, you could try to obtain a letter from your local Chamber of Commerce, which says that the business is likely to be present work opportunities for people in the community and be successful, an important part of the community. You can also try to get a letter from a CPA. So the letter would say they've seen businesses of this type, the amount of investment, and that the amount of investment is generally sufficient for that type of business. You would also want to draft a strong business plan. This would be important regardless of the type of business and regardless of the size of the investment. The business plan is important. It generally will show your plan from year 1 to year 5, and it will illustrate to the officer how you plan to operate your business, how many people you intend to hire, how you intend to market, those types of things. So what are some common E-2 visa expenditures? E-2 business expenditures are those expenses that are needed for the business to be operational. So if the expenditure is needed for the business, then we generally think of that as a strong expense. But common expenditures could include setting up your website, purchasing computer, printer, scanner, tablets, iPads, obtaining the inventory. So it can be shipped from another country, but it does not have to be purchased in the US. Also, the purchase of furniture, but it needs to be used for the US company. So if you're purchasing furniture, but it's used at your home, that would not be sufficient. You could also, if needed, obtain trademark and intellectual property purchases or development, employee payroll or independent contractor payments, legal fees, your lease. So some people will prepay their lease for, it could be, 6 months to a year. The important thing to remember is you can't include the payments for the lease unless you've actually made those payments. Also, software, advertising, or other office supplies could be strong expenditures. So we will now switch over to our partner, Kelly. Kelly is going to continue discussing what expenditures would be considered weak.
Thank you, Katie. Perfect. So, Katie's just gone over some of the strong expenditures that could be used for an E2. And while there are some strong expenditures, there are also expenditures that we don't suggest including because they may kind of up your investment amount, but often the officer will remove them. Or if they look at them, they may think, well, this person is really reaching in terms of what they're spending money on. And, then sometimes it can give them a negative impression of the file. So certain things we wouldn't normally include, for example, travel. So some people, they say, well, I've traveled to the US a few times to kind of get my business set up. Can I include the flights for that? We generally don't recommend that. We don't, there's even some consulates where on their website they will say, please do not include these types of receipts because they just don't view them as very strong. If there was a very specific important conference or event, that's like well known in the industry, then you may be able to include, for example, the ticket for that. But just generally, any kind of business travel to the US or within the US is not a very strong expense. A car or a vehicle. Now, this one, it could be a strong expense depending on your type of business. So, for example, if you're setting up a food truck or a mobile grooming company, both of which are things that we've done, obviously you'll need some type of vehicle for that. Or if you're going to have a construction company, or maybe a franchise, for kids' sports where you need to haul a lot of equipment. These are the types of things where a car or a vehicle that is going to be, either purchased by the company, used for commercial purposes, then it could be a strong expense. It doesn't really work to use a car or vehicle if you're going to use it for driving to work and then also for your personal needs. So very often people will say, well, I'll have to get a car anyway, so can I just include that in my E2 investment list? And it's really, again, it's not a good idea unless there's a very specific reason for your business. Travel, again, like a hotel, meals, transportation, anything related to that, even if it's kind of to meet with clients, are just not considered strong E2 expenditures, entertainment. And then also expenses paid to related parties. And what we mean here is, let's say that you're starting a business in the United States and you have a business in your home country, and that business in your home country sets up websites. And so you pay the business in your home country to set up the website for your US company. That type of expenditure, it's hypothetically possible that you use this, but they are looked at with a lot of scrutiny. And, we wouldn't recommend it because if it does come to the attention of the officer, well, you paid this company, for the website. It looks like it has a similar name to your E2 company. Now they may think, well, you're not really putting money at risk in the commercial sense. You're not really irrevocably committing your funds. You're just paying yourself, for these, so that doesn't really look good for your case. So these types of things we wouldn't recommend including because it will actually weaken the case. Perfect. All right, let's talk about some specific challenges and tips for consulting businesses. We do a lot of consulting businesses, and they do have some kind of very specific things you want to consider. They can be very good for the E2, but they are cases that are looked at with more scrutiny. And part of the reason is that theoretically, a very low investment is needed to start a consulting business. However, to get the E2, you have to show that you are committed to successfully operating the enterprise by investing a substantial amount of funds. And so it's a very common question we get where people will say, well, I have my knowledge. I own a laptop already. I don't need an office space. What could I possibly spend money on? To get the E2. And so, we have a few strategies that we use to advise people in this regard. So one is that unfortunately, you will kind of have to get comfortable with spending money. Even if theoretically you could spend no money or just a few $100s to get the case, or to get your business up and running. And that's what you might do if you were an entrepreneur, elsewhere. If you want the E2 visa, the investment is going to be part of it. We do recommend spending the money strategically, though. So one thing you can do is, you'll have to create a 5-year business plan and kind of look forward, 1 year, 2 years. What are you going to be spending the money on? And see if you can bring any of those expenses, kind of forward to spend to spend them now. So for example, office space, you can prepay for 6 to 12 months. Equipment, so maybe you're going to hire, an assistant in year one and then two more people in year two. Maybe you purchase the laptops and phones and printers and everything for those employees now instead of waiting until they're hired. With marketing, maybe you don't really need a website yet, or you don't need a marketing plan because you have a lot of client contacts, but maybe you spend the money on that now because in year two, you would have spent money for a really, fancy looking website. Maybe you spend that money now because it's going to be better. Maybe you hire a branding expert, or you do some type of additional marketing, to build out your brand earlier than you would have normally. It's also important to remember you need to spend over a large number of categories. And what we mean is you want to spend in kind of every area that would be relevant for setting up a business. So it's not going to look good if you say, well, I spent, $200 to set up a bare bones website, and then I bought a car for $40,000, or even if it's a strong expenditure, I spent a lot of money to rent an office space, and then I, went to Staples and got a printer and some pens. None of that's not going to look strong, even if you've spent $50,000. So you want to spend in a variety of categories, that are all kind of relevant for a normal type of operating consulting business. So things like office space, equipment, marketing, software, insurance, payroll, anything related to having employees. All of those are going to be good, E2 expenditures. You also can consider obtaining kind of articles, market research reports, or from kind of business organizations that talk about how much it normally costs to get this type of business up and running. And that can be helpful to show, let's say there's a business magazine that says consulting businesses can be started for, $5,000, and you can include that and show, well, I've spent well in excess of that amount. And that just helps to bolster your argument that you really have, spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running. Um, for consulting businesses, you also just want to keep in mind that they are very sensitive to the idea of a consultant coming in and just operating as a solo consultant. And that's really not what the E2 is for. The E2 is for an investor who wants to kind of develop and direct a business that is going to support more than just the investor. So that means they want to see the business is going to hire people, create a substantial economic impact. And so one thing that can be very helpful here is if you do hire an employee before you file. Well, it isn't required. It can help on multiple levels. One is that anything you pay to the employee or anything you pay related to the employee, like getting a payroll provider set up, insurance, all of that can be included in your investment schedule. And the other thing is that it just addresses this concern of they have about the marginality requirement. So it addresses the concern and says, hey, I've already hired somebody. I'm not just going to be a solo consultant and never hire anyone. All right, let's move to talk about kind of real estate businesses for the E2. So, um, again, we have done many of these types of cases, but they do have some specific challenges. One main challenge is that real estate ownership, by itself without kind of some other, activity is going to be considered passive. So if you kind of for example, if you own a property and you rent it out, that by itself is not going to be enough for the E2. And they even have it on the consular kind of websites in the Q&A where they'll say, no, you cannot just purchase a property and put it into the name of an LLC and use that for your E2 investment. So you do have to think about how am I going to show this is a real and operating company that's going to have revenue, be able to hire employees, that it's not just kind of speculative investment, or I'm not just collecting real estate, income. You have to show you're going to need those employees. So some potential E2 ideas here that we have done in the past. So a brokerage firm, a property management company, a real estate kind of renovation or construction. Also, house flipping can work, but only on a large scale. And for any of these, you also want to think about what are the licensing requirements, if there are any. So, if you're a real estate agent or a broker, if you're doing a construction company where you need to be a general contractor, a lot of times there are very state-specific requirements for these things. And so you want to make sure you've taken that into account. Sometimes if you can't get that license until you have a social security number and you don't have one, maybe you partner with another local business or with a particular agent or contractor, until you can get that license. But these these are all things that they may ask you about. So you want to be thinking about if you're doing a real estate company. And finally, with the house flipping, we have done this before, but again, it has to be done on a very large scale, which usually means the investment amount is going to need to be very high. So we had a client who had a portfolio of 30 to 40 homes, that they're working on flipping. So there's a lot of employment involved. But there was also a very high investment amount because they had to purchase those homes. Uh, if you want to do house flipping, but you don't really have the capital to do it on that large scale, one thing you can also consider is having a different type of company, like a renovation company or a property management company that's more service based. And then house flipping could be kind of a secondary, service offering that you have that maybe you'll offer in the future. And that's something you can plan for in your E2 business plan. All right, so equity trading companies has a lot of similar considerations to, kind of real estate. So one is just the concern: will this really be an active operating business? If you can't just kind of place the stock portfolio into the name of an LLC. If you're doing day trading or personal investing, this can start to look like it's not really going to have enough, activity to hire employees and be considered a real and operating company. You do want to show that you're going to go beyond friends and family in terms of your clients, and that you're going to be able to hire workers in the U.S. It's also a very highly regulated industry. You have to show you have proper licenses. If you're doing something like a hedge fund as well, or something like that, also want to think about what is the structure. Where is there going to be revenue? Where are there going to be employees? You want to choose that entity as your E2 entity because that's what's going to allow you to continue to renew the visa and show that you're meeting those requirements. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about E2 denials and some reasons for E2 denials. So one would be low investment amount. We've talked today about some strategies for, kind of mitigating low investment amounts, but there are some investments that are just too low. So for example, we had a client that, applied on their own, spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That's just not going to be enough to demonstrate to the officer that you have, you're committed to operating the enterprise. This person, like revisited the application, spent closer to 50,000 with 50,000 as working capital and was ultimately approved. So one potential benefit of a denial based on low investment amount is if you do have working capital or additional funds to invest, it can be one of the simpler fixes, in terms of a denial. Another reason might be nature of the business. So we've talked today that there are some businesses like consulting, real estate, equity trading, that while these are possible for the E2, they are going to have some more scrutiny on them. And so if you are kind of applying with that type of business, it's going to be more important that you have a very strong application and that all those issues are kind of addressed, so the officer feels they can approve. Filing location and venue are also very important for the E2. So, although the law and the regulations are the same, consulates really do have different interpretations of what these things mean. And because substantial investment doesn't have a number attached to it and is really based on kind of what is the cost to get this type of business up and running, which can be somewhat subjective. There are consulates that they're used to seeing extremely large, multinational companies. And so when they see a small business owner investing $60,000, they're less open to that type of application. So you do want to discuss with your attorney about what your filing options are. It used to be the case that there was a bit more flexibility in terms of filing in maybe a country where, you were not a citizen of that country, you didn't live there. That is really no longer the case right now. There was a policy change last year that really strongly, counseled that people need to apply in either their country of residence or their country where they hold a passport. So definitely an important thing to talk about with your attorney as there's different trends at various consulates. The next two reasons for denial are kind of related. So these are both related to the marginality requirement. Will you create jobs? So let's say you've had a similar business in your home country for many, many years and you never hired anyone. If that's the case, they may be less willing to believe your 5-year business plan that claims you will hire people. So this is a situation where it would really help your case to maybe hire somebody before you file. Even though it's not required, it will help just address that concern up front. So if they feel that the business is not going to create jobs for U.S. workers, it's not going to meet that marginality requirement, and they're not going to approve it. So this is why, for example, even if you're purchasing a business, if you're purchasing a business that's only ever had one part-time employee, that's not going to be very strong business to purchase for the E2. You'll need to convince the officer that you're going to change the business model and expand it such that it can support more than just one part-time employee. Um, Another reason might be issues with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They have different levels of training. They have different, kind of experience, and levels of familiarity with the law. If you feel like you got an officer who is extremely, kind of unprofessional or just completely off base, generally your best bet is going to be to reapply. They usually do try to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but in my experience, they do, really try to do that at most consulates. If there's really kind of major legal issues, there are some avenues you can try to use, but they're very long, and uncertain of a positive result. So usually best to reapply, and kind of explain, try to politely address whatever the issues were, with a different officer. Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes people will file cases either on their own or maybe with counsel that's not immigration counsel, and maybe the entire investment is, secured by the assets of the E2 company, or the treaty investor only owns, 5% of the company and the rest is owned by a U.S. citizen. In those types of cases where it's just very clear you didn't meet the baseline requirements, you would want to go back to the drawing board, get immigration counsel who understands the specific nuances of the E2, revisit the case if it's possible, and then refile. All right, let's turn to some government adjudication trends. Approval rates, the government posts approval rates between kind of 80 and 90%. We have quite a high approval rate in the high 90s, although past results do not predict future outcomes. Nobody can ever guarantee that your visa will be issued. It's just not possible to do. Turning to timelines, so in London right now, it's about kind of 90 business days that they're taking to review the case, and then once they review it, they'll allow you to schedule an interview, which is usually available within a month or so. So it is a process of several months right now in London. In Toronto as well, right now they're taking about 10 to 15 business days to review cases, and then usually you can schedule an interview with that within about 2 to 3 months. In terms of timelines generally, it really is specific to the consulate. There are some consulates where it could be a year or more until you get an interview. Many consulates are kind of better than that, but it's usually a review process of at least several weeks and, very often kind of 2 months or more. So in terms of USCIS versus the consulate, there are two ways you can apply for the E2 visa. One is you can apply for a visa at a consulate outside the United States. Another is that you can apply for a change of status with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And this option is only available for people who are already in the United States in a valid status. So, for example, let's say you came on a B1 visa to investigate opportunities for the E2, and for some reason it's just easier for you to apply from within the United States. Or you're on an H-1B and you want to start a business. Notably, ESTA does not permit you to change status. So if you come, on ESTA to investigate or to be a tourist, and then you want to change your status, that wouldn't be possible. But if you do have a B1, B2 visa, that could be an option for you. Very important things to consider because these are quite different. If you do a change of status, you are not going to get a visa stamp in your passport that allows for international travel. Additionally, you will only get a 2-year approval. So there are some people like Canadians, or citizens of the UK where you could get a 5-year multi-entry visa at the consulate. For those types of applicants, they often will want to apply at the consulate to give them the ability to travel, to get that 5-year visa instead of 2 years. However, there are people, for example, like a citizen of Bangladesh, or of Egypt, who they can only get an E2 visa single entry for 3 months. They may prefer to do a change of status in the United States, because getting the visa won't give them any appreciable benefit. There are some other important differences between a USCIS filing and the consulate. One benefit of USCIS is that you can pay an additional fee to get an answer within 15 business days. That can be an approval, denial, or request for more evidence. And then you can get a final answer, after that. So there is kind of more certainty with the timeline. A downside of USCIS is they take a very, very strict view of the source and trail of funds for the E2, whereas a consulate might take a very high level look at the source of funds documentation. USCIS will want to track the money from its source all the way through to it being maintained, through to it being spent on the E2 expenses. So if you have a very complex source of funds with a lot of different sources, USCIS may be a difficult option for you. Um, Moving to kind of post-specific considerations. So each consulate will have kind of its own set of instructions. Consulates that process E-2 visas a lot often have a lot of detail about what they want. They often have page limits, size, file size limits, specific things that need to be included that may be relevant, for that particular country. So you do want to make sure that you're familiar with those instructions. There's also preferences. So as I mentioned previously, certain consulates are used to seeing kind of very, large companies, and there's some that are more friendly to, smaller investors. You want to just be aware as much as you can of what are the preferences and discuss that with your attorney. Also, CPA certification of business plans. Certain consulates have started asking for this, so it's a very common request for a start for a startup to get a 5-year business plan. And some consulates, for example, in Mexico and in Singapore, are asking that the financials of that business plan be validated by a CPA. So you want to just have, keep that in mind because that is a requirement and they will ask for that at the interview. We do have a CPA on our staff and we do also offer the service of drafting business plans. So if that is something you're interested in, you can always contact us, after the presentation and we're happy to give you more detail about our business plan drafting services. Okay, let's quickly run through some issues in complex areas for the E2. Some of these we've touched on before. So do you have to hire employees before you apply? The answer is no, but in certain circumstances, it can be a good idea to do that. And there are some times when certain consulates will go through phases where they're really fixated on needing employees. That's not the legal standard, but if you are applying at that type of consulate, you want to keep that in mind because it might be a good idea, to strengthen the case. So complicated source and trail of funds, if you're doing a USCIS filing and you have a very complex source of funds, unfortunately, you will have to document all of that. Um, Loans and gifts can be sources of funds for the E2. However, if you're getting a gift, the gift giver has to be comfortable sharing their financial documentation to prove where they got the money. So it's not if let's say your mother wants to give you a gift letter alone is not enough. Your mother would also have to provide her tax returns or proof she sold the property or whatever documents were relevant to where she got the money. Loans can be acceptable if they are personal loans, either unsecured or secured on the investor's personal property. What does not work is if the loan is secured by the assets of the E2 business. So sometimes this comes up in seller financing situations. So let's say you're purchasing a business, you're going to put down 50% and the rest is seller financing secured by the E2 company. That does not work for an E2. It's not a good approach. So before you kind of finalize that structure, you want to make sure that you are, discussing with your immigration counsel. E2 visas for two investors. So this is possible, but the ownership has to be 50-50. If the investors are the same and the investors each need to invest, right? So you can't kind of have one person invest 100,000 and one person invest 5,000. If they're the same nationality, you could potentially consider an investor and employee applications. But if they have different nationalities, it has to be 50-50 and each has to invest. And generally, it should be a similar amount. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. This is an important one. Sometimes people will get a 5-year visa, for the E2, and they think, great, I have a work visa, I can work. And it is more limited than that. The E2 visa allows you to work for the E2 company in the area that was outlined in your business plan that was presented to the consulate. So if there's major changes in ownership, you sell the majority share of the company and now you only own 30%, and you have a US citizen partner owning 70%. That is a problem. If you no longer own 50% and control the company, it's not considered an E2 company anymore, and you would not be, maintaining your status even if your visa is still valid. Similarly, a change in the type of business that is a substantial change. So you were running a restaurant and now you're going to shut it down and you're going to start up a wedding photography business. That is not permitted without first going back to the consulate or USCIS and getting an approval. If there's a change in the business, it's kind of a natural outgrowth. So let's say you were a marketing agency focused on the entertainment industry, and now it turns out all your clients are in finance, but you're still doing marketing. That's really not a substantial change that's going to be a problem because you're still doing the same thing. You're still a marketing agency. So if you do feel the business is really starting to veer off from what the plan was and not in a way that's a natural outgrowth, you want to discuss that with your immigration attorney before that happens, so you can go back and get either a new approval or get a new E2 visa if you need. Um, Family business purchases. So this is something where, if you are purchasing a business from a family member, they are going to look at it with more scrutiny. You want to get an independent valuation to explain that what you paid is a substantial amount and makes sense in light of the company's financials. So impact of the new administration. So there's been many executive orders that are pretty much aimed at kind of enhanced vetting for all visa applicants. So that's to say there's not anything specific referencing the E2 visa, but all visa applicants, are impacted by these in the sense that there's additional vetting, additional screening, any criminal issues that you've ever had, even if kind of vetted and approved in the past, you want to be just mindful that they may look into those more closely. You don't want to just assume that anything is going to be okay. Uh, we do anticipate, that they'll want to see kind of higher investment, higher employee numbers. This is always going to strengthen your case, but in particular, the purpose of the E2 program is to encourage, and facilitate economic benefit between, the U.S. and the treaty country. So the more that you can kind of invest in the United States, the stronger your case is going to be. The more you can show you've hired U.S. citizens, the stronger your case is going to be. Approval rates did not change much from 2016 to 2020. Again, though, we are, this is a new environment and there is, significant focus on vetting, any type of application. So you do want to keep that in mind. All right, so we've reached the end of the presentation. We can see if there's any questions that have come in. So one question, would the new business be expected to show they can pay enough to support the investor and their family for the first year, or would they be happy that you have income from the UK business? So we have not noticed a focus on kind of the investor making a large salary in the first year. We do usually estimate that there will be kind of some nominal salary, maybe somewhere between 30 to 50,000, and generally indicate that the owner may take distributions as needed. But that's not so much the focus. They're more focused on, will the business make enough money to hire workers, particularly for a startup. The standard is that you want to show that over a 5-year period. So they're not as much focused on the initial salary for the investor. Um, so someone has asked, I'm building a mobile app with early revenue. If I form an LLC and make ongoing at-risk investments over a year, can they be counted when I apply, or does it have to be made all at once? So it can be made over time. I think the important thing is that you're documenting that the investments are being made. It's also important to note that revenue the business earns that is then spent is not counted as E2 investment. To be E2 investment, it has to be your personal funds that are being put into the company. If there's revenue the company is earning and then it's just being spent on normal business expenses, that won't count towards your E2 investment. So it would need to be kind of you investing money and that being spent, and then documenting the transfer, the source, all the receipts and invoices. I will say that they are not this like strong expenses are not kind of recurring small expenses. So kind of paying your phone bill for a year. Not that you can't include it, but it's not looked at very favorably. They do want to see expenses that are directly related to getting the company up and running. All right. Don't see any more questions. So I think we will close here. So Katie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure to be on this webinar with you today and to speak to everyone. Um, we're going to close in a minute, but I see someone said they have a question. If you want to write in a question quickly. we can answer it. So someone has said you have a plan for a used medical equipment business. Yeah, so if there's kind of very specific questions about your business model, I would suggest setting up a consultation. That's going to be the best place to do that. But since we haven't gotten anything else in, we're going to close here. But I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.